Welcome to EnduringTechnologyPress.com. I'm Eric, and I figured before I ripped into my second loaf, the first one disappeared pretty quickly, of homemade sourdough triticale bread. And this, you probably never had it if you don't grind your own flour. Triticale is a cross between rye and wheat. It makes a fantastic flour. Makes something that is fairly close to a light rye bread. Just great. I love it for baking. Hard to get the flour again unless you grind your own, which I do. But I figured before I ripped into the sourdough loaf, I'd give you a little bit of my impressions on the sourdough starter that's available from King Arthur Flour. And I've used a lot of sourdough starters. And to trace back exactly when I started making sourdough, I actually dug up one of the first magazines that I got, and it was first subscription that my grandparents on my mom's side got for me, Harrismith, which, if you're American, you probably don't recognize it. It's a Canadian version, I guess, of Mother Earth News. I don't even know if it's still published anymore, but it was great. Sort of like a traditional Mother Earth News, lots of homesteading type stuff, with a lot of neat things on baking, brewing beer, making wine, that type of thing. Really cool. And then it just, you know, disintegrated and went off into like a faux country chic decorating pile of trash, and I canceled my subscription. But I had this for years and years and years. And this particular issue is from, is number 78 from March-April 1988. And it has sourdough. And this was one of the things that finally kick-started me into doing my own bread with sourdough and experimenting with it. And I started making my own starter. And that puts me at 13. And coincidentally, my mother had the unfortunate displeasure to have a disc in her back go out, and was laid up on the second floor of our house in Winnipeg at the time on a sheet of plywood. So I ended up taking over the kitchen and groceries and cooking and stuff like that. So if I wanted to make bread rather than buy it, I could do that and just hear my mother say, "Eric, what are you doing down there in my kitchen?" But I knew she wasn't coming. She more or less abdicated that space for better part of a year to me. So I had a good chance at that time to play around with sourdough, making my own starters, trying some of these. There's a little bit of romance too with the, making bread from sourdough. They came with books like this, Wilderness Cooking, which I really enjoy as well. And I got hooked on it. Sourdough offers a peculiar flavor, a little bit tart, that is really, really neat. I guess the other part is I like the control, the options that it gives you compared to using commercial yeast. With a little bit more planning, and that's the fundamental downside. If you've got a good sourdough starter, it just takes a little bit longer than commercial yeast, right? Commercial yeast, that's really concentrated. It's a great product, but if you can plan ahead a little bit more, you can get a lot more diversity and really artisanal products out of the symbiotic cultures that you get with the yeast and the other organisms that are in sourdough. That goes for bread, which it works really well with, as well as other things like biscuits or waffles. I particularly love whole wheat sourdough waffles. Those are just amazing. But you need to get things going the night before. You walk away. It doesn't take that much more time. It just takes a little bit more forethought. So over those many years, I've been playing with sourdough, except for, a little bit of time when I disappeared off to university for a couple of years. and you know, I wasn't going to bring my sourdough starter with me. When I came back, and I've been back for a long time and working, I went through a bunch of more sourdough starters. Again, from ones that I started up, either using commercial yeast as a base or yeast off of grapes. I've done yeast off of just out of the airborne yeast and cultures with potato water, with rye flour, all sorts of different ones. I've tried the prepackaged ones, purporting to be either Alaskan or San Francisco sourdough. And you can get really good products. But I tried and I picked up King Arthur Flour's particular strain a couple years ago now, and I picked up their crock at the same time, which really works rather well, and I'll explain that in a minute or two. And after that, I sort of discarded all of the other starters that I played around with and kept samples or dried out, and you know, could always go back and revert. This one is exceptional. It's not super sour. If it was a little bit more sour, that would be a little bit nice. But what really sets this one apart is it's got a good amount of tang, but it's incredibly vigorous. And that's what I really like. And all of my starters, I kept them, you know, well conditioned. I use them fairly frequently. One of the secrets I do here, and I continue to do it, is it's not just when I'm baking with something that would use that yeast and that starter culture from the sourdough that I usually toss in a cup of this. I'll toss it into pretty much any baking that I'm doing. And that way, you know, out goes a cup into the baking. You know, you're making cookies, toss a cup in there. You're making biscuits, even though if they're not sourdough biscuits, toss a cup in. You know, you're making another type of loaf of bread, though I tend to usually have sourdough versions of bread. In it goes. In goes another cup of flour and half cup of water. And this is a fairly stiff starter. I originally started off with ones that were much runnier. And I found those to be a little bit more sour, but the vigor in them lacked significantly. The thicker ones, in particular the King Arthur flour, not as tangy, but a lot more vigor and a lot, you know, more leavening to your breads on a much more rapid basis. And I guess that's where it brings in this crock. And you can use another container. You don't have to use their crock. When I had more liquid cultures, I often used an old glass jar. One of the glass jars would be sealed by the rubber ring, sort of the old-fashioned version of the Tatler lid that I like so much now. You can certainly use a Tatler lid on the, you know, wide-mouth Tatler lid on a jar. Don't seal it down, and use that as sort of a cheap option. But even on a liter jar, liter and a half jar, you're going to have difficulty getting, you know, certainly a full cup scoop, but more likely something that's about a third of a cup, half a cup in that jar to take it out. And that, if you're using a much more liquidy starter, that works fine. You can sort of scoop and pour it out and spoon it out. If you're using a much more solid starter, having a nice big crock that you can pull off the top, you know, put your scoop in, take out your material, put in your flour, stir it up, works a lot better. It just reduces the hassle, right? And reducing the hassle sees you use things more often. The other thing that I use, other than, you know, going through this fairly often, and King Arthur, I guess, says, you know, use it on a weekly basis, or just toss, you know, a cup once a week if you're not baking with it. I haven't found that to be necessary. While I do a whole lot of baking, enough to justify, you know, making my own grain mill and grinding my own whole grain flours. You know, I've gone away for trips, I've gone away to the cottage, I've gone away into the bush. I usually store my sourdough starter in the fridge. I don't find that it loses vigor in there very quickly. So what I'll do is, after I've taken out a cup of this, I'll put in a cup of flour, I'll put in half cup of water, I'll mix it around, and I'll usually leave it overnight or for a day, something like that, on the counter. Room temperature. You'll come back, you'll see it's active, it's vigorous. I take it then, put it in the fridge. And you know, if you don't come back to it for a week, 2 weeks, I haven't found any loss of viability in it. I haven't found any need to, you know, go through a whole new cycle of adding that extra flour and stuff like that before I could successfully take out a cup and use it to use it in the baking. So that's my strategy in terms of maintaining it. Again, exceptionally vigorous starter. Really, you know, sourdough starter allows you to go a little bit more towards producer on that continuum of the chain, you know, from consumer to producer. Consumer would be, absolute consumer would just be buying your bread. You know, then you can make your bread with commercial yeast. You know, this is one more step towards having a little bit more control and a little bit, you know, more of a say in how your daily bread gets produced and having those components necessary to produce it. It's a lot of fun, just requires a little bit more forethought, you know, and when you get down to a lot of things, there's an intimidation factor there that, you know, I think stops people from thinking they can bake successfully with sourdough. It really is easy. You can go see the King Arthur website. They've got some great resources. EnduringTechnologyPress.com has some cool recipes that I like as well. But even things that are, you know, way off on the scale of doing it yourself, like building your own grain mill. When you distill it down, you can do things in a very complex way that, you know, are difficult to jump in right away. But you can also do entry-level stuff, and that's sort of when I designed the grain mill project. It's entry-level. It's designed that anybody can start metalworking at that stage and come out with a really desirable product. I think the same thing, though on a lesser scale of intimidation, goes for baking with sourdough. Give it a try, even if it's something like, you know, sourdough waffles and biscuits. Those are fantastic. One of the limitations in terms of bread baking, you can incorporate it into some of your breads if you're making stuff in the bread machine. But if you're doing that, you're never going to really replace and go whole hog with sourdough starter. I've never found the cycles long enough to give you the time to allow that starter to develop. For instance, you know, triticale, rye, generally take a longer period to rise. This, you do a starter overnight with sourdough. You come back, you blend in your additional flour and ingredients, you do your kneading, and then you sit it aside for 3 to 5 hours while it doubles in bulk and produces that awesome loaf, and then you bake it for 45 minutes. Your total involvement isn't significant, but there's no bread machine cycle until somebody comes up with an Arduino hack that overrides everything in the machine that is going to handle that. At least none of the bread machines I've ever seen. And that really puts you to something like having a stand mixer. You can certainly do it by hand, and that's how I started. But man, a stand mixer really makes the difference with the dough hook. That makes things very easy, very simple, to the point where you're probably not going to want to go out and buy bread unless you just don't have any alternatives and you're short of time. So if you're thinking about baking with sourdough, and I think you should give it a try. It's not difficult and it's a lot of fun. I'd really recommend King Arthur's sourdough starter. And, you know, get the crock while you're at it if you have a few bucks. It's an easy way to store it. Your other storage options, you know, a glass mason jar or something like that are out there that are applicable. But this is an easy way to do it, and it looks kind of cute when you have it on the counter for that period where it's recharging. So for more on this and other cool things to empower your independence, go to enduringtechnologypress.com. Thanks.